Bride was hired only to sew, but she broke every cattle rustling ring in the county. The needle was the first thing I noticed about her. Not her face, not the way she stepped down off the stage with one hand gripping the iron rail like she expected the ground to give way. The needle. She had one threaded and pinched between her lips while she reached back up for her bag, and she pulled it out with 2 fingers and tucked it into the lapel of her coat without breaking stride, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like she always had a needle ready. Like the world might come apart at the seams without warning, and she intended to be prepared. I was standing under the overhang of the Butterfield Depot in Dalhart with my hat pulled low, because the November wind off the lawn was the kind that cuts. Gus Pickett, who ran the rafter P, had sent me to collect the woman he'd hired to mend and sew for the outfit through winter. His wife, Dorcas, had gone back to Missouri that October to tend to her mother and wasn't coming back until spring. And there was a mountain of mending piled up in the back room, and 3 hands who'd come through the fall roundup with gear that needed replacing. So Gus had answered an advertisement from a woman in San Antonio who said she could sew anything from buckskin to silk and would work honest wages. That was her description of herself. I remembered it because Gus had read it out loud at supper, and somebody laughed and said, "Who cares about silk out here?" Gus said he cared about buckskin, so I'd ridden the 12 miles to town in the cold to pick up the seamstress. Her name was Nora Voss. She was maybe 32, 33. Brown hair coiled up under a gray wool hat. She was narrow through the shoulders and had a precise, deliberate way of moving, like someone who'd learned early that wasted motion costs you. She had a trunk and a leather satchel, and when I offered to take the trunk, she looked at me the way you look at someone you haven't decided about yet. "Obliged," she said, that was all. We didn't talk much on the ride out. The wind was too mean for it. She sat the wagon bench with her coat pulled closed and watched the country go by, the blonde grass, the caliche breaks, the sky that out here in late November turns the color of a healed bruise, and she didn't look frightened of it. Some people come to the lawn o' Estacado from back east, and the flatness unsettles them, the way there's nothing to stop the eye. She didn't look unsettled. She looked like she was reading something. I told her the basics. Rafter P ran about 800 head. Gus was a fair man. Winter work was mostly mending, some cutting and fitting for the hands who needed new gear. The cookhouse was warm. Her room was off the main house, the small one that shared a wall with the kitchen. She asked one question. "How many men on the place?" I said 11, counting Gus and myself. She nodded and didn't ask anything else. "My name is Cal Briggs. I was 49 that winter, which out on the lawn felt like older. I've been at the Rafter P going on 14 years, which meant I'd outlasted 2 foremen before me, a drought, a die-up, a grass fire that took a quarter section in one afternoon, and Gus Pickett's temper, which was considerable. I was the foreman now, had been for 6 years. I knew every water hole and fence line and the temperament of every horse in the string. I knew which of the hands worked steady and which needed watching. I was the man Gus called when something went wrong at 2 in the morning, which was most of the time when something went wrong. I was good at my job. I'd been good at my job for a long time, and I didn't think much about it, same way you don't think much about breathing. It was just what I was. I had a war behind me, the kind of war that ends and the ending doesn't actually feel like an ending. And I had a marriage that lasted 4 years, and then my wife Clara died of a fever in the summer of 1878, and I put her in the ground outside of Tascosa and rode south and never went back. I didn't have children. I had the Rafter P and a good horse and a room above the tack barn, and that was enough. Most days it was enough. I'm telling you this so you understand the shape of the thing before it changed. Nora got to work the morning after she arrived. I came around to the main house at first light to talk to Gus about the south fence line, and she was already in the back room with a lamp burning and the pile of mending sorted into 3 stacks. Saddle blankets here, shirts here, leather tack there. She'd done all that sorting in the dark of early morning before anyone was up. I stood in the doorway a moment. She was working on a bridle, her hands moving quickly, the waxed thread pulling tight. She looked up. I told her I was just passing through to see Gus. She said, "The split-ear headstall on the wall there, the left cheek strap is cracked through. Not just surface. It'll fail when someone's on a green horse." I went and looked. She was right. I hadn't noticed it. I thanked her, and she went back to her work. That was Nora. She noticed things. The hands were mostly respectful. A couple of the younger ones, Delbert Ash, who was 22 and loud about it, and a kid we called Poco who came up from below the caprock and didn't speak much English were awkward around her in the way young men are awkward around a woman when they're not sure of the rules. But they settled. Gus made it clear without making a speech about it that Nora Voss was an employee of the rafter piece, same as anyone, and would be treated accordingly. The only one who didn't settle was a man named Trace Corrigan. Corrigan had been on the place 8 months. He was a writer, technically, a competent one. But there was something about him that had never sat right with me, a quality I'd tried to put a name to a dozen times and couldn't quite get. He was the kind of man who always knows where everyone else is, always aware of who's coming and going, what's being said, what's in the freight wagon when it comes out from town. He had a sycamore gray eyes that moved around a room before he did. He asked questions that seemed like small talk but weren't. I'd told Gus about it once early on. Gus said Corrigan worked clean and drew no trouble, and that was good enough. I let it go. Maybe I was wrong about the man. I started to know I wasn't wrong the 3rd week of November. I'd been doing what I did every year that time of year, the final tallying, riding the pastures, counting what we'd brought through the fall and accounting for what we'd lost. The numbers that year didn't add up right, not dramatically, not so you'd holler fire. But we were down maybe 30 head from what the books showed, and when I rode the southeast corner to look for stragglers, the ground out by the Tule Creek break showed traffic. Shod horses, multiple animals. A cattle track that headed south toward the Caprock Rim and didn't come back. I didn't say anything yet, wanted to be sure. I was sure by the 1st week of December. We were missing closer to 60 head by then, all of them from the south pasture, from the section farthest from the main buildings. The kind of theft that's done quietly, a few at a time, by people who know the country and know the schedule and know which pasture Gus's boys don't check after dark. I went to Gus. He went pale and then red, and he wanted to ride to the sheriff in Dalhart that same afternoon. I told him to wait. I told him the sheriff, Eldon Burke, was a man I didn't entirely trust, and that riding in there announcing we'd been cleaned out would tip off whoever was behind it before we could find out who that was. Gus didn't like waiting, but he trusted me. He'd trusted me for 14 years, so he waited. What I didn't know, and wouldn't know for another 2 weeks, was that Nora already had more of the picture than I did. She came to the tack barn on a Thursday evening, middle of December. I was working late on the harness inventory, a lamp hung on a nail overhead, my breath making steam in the cold. She came in without knocking, there was no door to knock on, and she stood there a moment while her eyes adjusted. I asked if something was wrong. She said, "Can I speak plainly?" I said yes. She said, "Trace Corrigan has been going through my things." I put down the hame strap I was holding. She said it straight without dramatics. She'd noticed small things moved, the order of her spools of thread disturbed. A letter she'd received from her sister in San Antonio, which she'd tucked between pages of her Bible, was now in the Bible backward. She couldn't prove any of it, and she knew that. But she'd been precise in the arrangement of her room, and what she was describing was not imagination. I asked her when it started. She said 3 days after I arrived. I asked her if anything was missing. She said no, not missing, read. She let that settle. I said, "What would he be looking for in your letters?" She looked at me with those careful, measuring eyes, and she said, "That's what I've been wondering, and there's something else." She reached into the pocket of her apron and put a piece of paper on the workbench between us. It was a receipt, a cattle buyer's receipt for 43 head of mixed steers, sold to a buyer in Amarillo named H. Calhoun, signed by an agent named R. Corrigan. "I found it," she said, "under the floorboard in the feed room. I wasn't snooping. The board was sprung and I nearly turned my ankle on it, and when I looked down the paper was there. R. Corrigan." I looked at the date. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago someone named R. Corrigan had sold 43 head to a buyer in Amarillo. I didn't know if R. Corrigan was Trace or a brother or a coincidence, but I had a number now and a name and a place. I asked Nora why she'd brought this to me and not to Gus. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Because Gus goes into town every Friday, because Corrigan knows that, and because I've watched you for 3 weeks and you are the man on this place who notices things." She said it flat, not as a compliment, as a statement of what she'd observed. I held at that, felt the weight of it land somewhere deep in the chest, the way a thing lands when it's been said by someone who means it precisely. I was good at my job and nobody said so, not in 3 or 4 years, not in words, because that wasn't how it was done out here. You were just expected to be good at your job, and you were. Nora said it like it was a fact she'd noted down in a column. I told her I was going to need her to be careful, to act like nothing had changed, and I told her I was going to need a few days. She said, "Whatever you need." She left. I sat with the receipt and the lamp and the smell of cold leather, and I thought for a while. I rode to Amarillo 2 days later. I told Gus I was going to look at some replacement horses being sold by a man north of town. That was even true, there were horses, and I did look at them. But I spent the better part of the day asking quiet questions about H. Calhoun, who turned out to be a buyer of moderate reputation who asked few questions about provenance and sold on to feedlots in Kansas. Calhoun himself was not hard to find. He had an office on Polk Street. I didn't go in. I sat in a saloon across the street and watched who came and went, and after about an hour a man came out who I knew. Not from the rafter-pea, I placed him after a moment. His name was Denny Stahl, and he worked for the Ladder Cross outfit west of Dalhart, a mid-sized operation run by a man named Warren Foss. That was enough for one day. I bought the horses and I came home. Foss, I turned the name around. Warren Foss was not a man I'd spent much time thinking about. He was neighboring ranchers with Gus in the technical sense. They shared no fence line but were close enough on the range to have occasion for it. They'd had a dispute some years back about water rights, a dry-year argument that got heated and then cooled when the rains came back. There was no love between them, but there was no ongoing trouble either. I'd seen Foss twice in the last year, both times in Dalhart. Quiet man, heavy through the shoulders, always dressed too well for a working rancher. He was running a ring. Had to be. Moving cattle from multiple outfits through Calhoun and Amarillo and splitting the take with the men he had on the inside. Which meant Corrigan was his man on the rafter-pea, which meant Gus's southeast pasture had been bleeding for some time, because we had a man inside reporting our schedule and our counts. I couldn't go to Burke. The sheriff had a habit, I'd noticed, of hearing things from ranchers and nothing ever coming of it, and Foss and Burke had been seen together in Dalhart more than once. Nothing you could put a finger on but the kind of comfortable ease between men that makes you think. I could write to the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Worth. But that took time, and I wasn't sure how much time I had before Corrigan moved the rest of what he'd identified to take. And I wasn't sure Corrigan hadn't already seen me asking questions in Amarillo through some channel I didn't know about. I had 3 days, maybe 4, to do something. What I did was go back to Nora. I told her what I'd found, all of it. I don't know exactly why I told her all of it. She'd earned some of it, certainly, with the receipt, but she'd earned maybe half of what I told her. The rest I told her because I was sitting across from her at the work table in the back room with the lamp between us, and she was the kind of person who, when you start talking, you just keep talking. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual. Most people interrupt. When I was done, she said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to write to the marshal's office in Fort Worth. But I need more than my own account of it, or it goes to the bottom of a stack. I need the receipt you found, and I need anything else that corroborates." She reached into her sewing kit, a deep thing, almost a box, and she produced a folded paper. "There's a second receipt," she said. "I found it yesterday under the same board. He must have been using it as a cache." The second receipt was for 28 head. Different date, same buyer, signed by T. Corrigan this time. She said, "And there's one more thing." She was quiet a moment. "The letter my sister sent me, the one that was moved, she mentioned in passing that she'd recommended me for this position to the agency in San Antonio, and that the agency had mentioned in the advertisement that the placement was with a ranch in Dalhart. I don't think Corrigan went through my things looking for something I brought with me. I think he was trying to find out who sent for me and why. He was worried someone had sent for me specifically. He was worried the rafter-pea knew more than it appeared to." I looked at her. "Why would he think that?" "Because he's a man who assumes everyone is as calculating as he is," she said, "and because I don't seem like a seamstress." She said it without any particular weight, like it was just another item in the column. I said, "Do you seem like a seamstress?" She picked up a piece of leather and held a needle to the lamp. "I can sew anything from buckskin to silk. That part was entirely accurate." She threaded the needle in one pass. "But I'm also the widow of a Texas Ranger, And I have been in rooms with dishonest men before, Mr. Briggs. I know how they move. A ranger's widow. I sat with that a moment, the way the thing shifts when you learn a fact like that. Not a naive woman alone on a frontier ranch. A woman who'd been beside a man who spent his life reading the dishonest ones, and then had spent years after learning to do it herself. She said, "My husband was killed 4 years ago, ambushed near Del Rio. 3 men who he'd been gathering evidence against before it was complete. I know what happened to evidence that goes to the wrong person too early." That's why you didn't want to go to Gus. Gus would have gone straight to Burke, you know that. I did know that. I asked her how long she'd known about the rustling. She said, "I suspected the first week. The way Corrigan moved, the hours he kept, confirmed it when I found the receipt." She'd suspected the first week. She'd been on the rafter 3 weeks, and she'd suspected the first week, and she'd been patient. She'd waited until she knew who to bring it to. I said, "You waited to be sure about me." She looked at me steadily, not unkindly. "Yes." Outside, the wind was working at the corner of the house. The lamp had burned down some. I could hear Gus in the main room, his chair scraping, the sound of him banking the stove for the night. I said, "All right, here's what I need to do." The letter went out the next morning with a man I trusted, Ed Hayes, who rode for a neighboring outfit and was riding to Amarillo for supplies and had no connection to either Foss or Corrigan. The letter went to Marshal Del Harker in Fort Worth, and it contained everything. The receipts, the names, the connection to Calhoun in Amarillo, and the names of at least 3 ranches I suspected Foss had been working with a man on the inside of. I'd ridden the country hard the day before, paying calls I'd been meaning to make for a month, and I'd asked careful questions and gotten careful answers, and by the time I sat down to write the letter I had enough that it wasn't just the word of one foreman with a grievance. I also wrote a separate letter to a man I knew in the state capital, a man who had reason to pay attention to a county sheriff who might be on the wrong side of things. Then I waited. Waiting is the hardest part of it. Not the writing, not the working, not even the risk. The waiting. Because while you're waiting, the thing can go sideways in 10 different ways, and all you can do is hold the shape of what you've built and not let it come apart. Corrigan didn't know I knew. I was sure of that. I'd been careful in Amarillo, and I'd said nothing here. He kept to his routines. Rode the south pasture, came in at supper, played cards with Poco and Delbert in the evenings. Normal. I watched him the way you watch something from the corner of your eye, because if you look straight at it, you give yourself away. Nora kept sewing. She had the whole back room organized to a degree Dorcas Pickett had never managed. The mending pile was down to almost nothing. She'd made 2 new saddle blankets from scratch, cut and stitched, out of material she'd ordered from Dalhart. She'd made Gus a new vest, which he wore to supper looking pleased with himself. She'd repaired the split-ear headstall I'd noted the first day, and a second one, and done something to the bridle leather that made it supple again when it had been cracking. I found myself finding reasons to pass the back room more than I needed to. I won't dress it up. I noticed her. I noticed the way she worked, the total concentration, the unhurried precision, the economy of her hands. I noticed that she hummed sometimes, not songs exactly, just a sound she made when she was thinking. I noticed that she drank her coffee without anything in it and held the cup in both hands. I noticed that she had a way of looking at you when you spoke that was fully present, not waiting for her turn to talk, actually listening, and it made you feel like what you were saying was worth hearing. I hadn't felt that in a long time. I didn't say any of this to her. We talked about the work, the ranch, the missing cattle, the plan. We talked sometimes about the country, about what it was like here in winter versus spring. Once she asked me about the war, and I told her a little of it, the parts that don't stay too long in the telling, and she didn't say I'm sorry or how terrible. She just listened, and then she said, "My husband used to say the hardest thing about that kind of work is knowing when it's done and when it isn't." I said I reckoned that was right. She said he was never sure. I didn't ask what she meant. I thought I knew. One evening, maybe the second week of December, I came past the back room and saw her at the work table not sewing. Just sitting, her hands flat on the table, looking at the wall. I stopped. She looked up. I asked if she was all right. She was quiet a moment, and then she said, "I am. I just sometimes it comes on me, the quiet. I don't always know what to do with it." I stood in the doorway. I said, "I know that quiet." She looked at me and something shifted in her face, just slightly. Not softness exactly. Recognition. Like she saw that I did know it and wasn't saying it to say something. She said, "Are you a lonely man, Mr. Briggs?" It wasn't a question I'd been asked in a while. Not like that direct, with the expectation of an honest answer. I thought about it. I said, "I suppose I am." She nodded like that was the right answer, or at least the true one. She picked up her needle and went back to her work. I went back to mine. But something had shifted, quiet as that. The marshal's men arrived on a Thursday. There were 3 of them, and they came in from the east on the Dalhart Road, which was not the road anyone expected them to come in on. Marshal Harker himself rode in front, a tall, rope-thin man in a black duster who had the face of someone who'd heard every story and believed very few of them. He had a commission paper and a warrant for Warren Foss, and he had information, he told Gus, that corroborated the letter sent by one C.W. Briggs, foreman, dated December 12th. Gus looked at me. I told him I'd explain later. What happened over the next 2 days I'll try to put in order, though the truth is it came in pieces. Foss had men on 4 ranches, not just the Rafterpee. The scale of it was larger than I'd guessed. Somewhere north of 200 head moved over the past 7 months, through Calhoun in Amarillo, and sold on to 3 different feedlots in Kansas. The records deliberately confused so the brands wouldn't trace back. Corrigan had been Foss's man on the Rafterpee, yes. But Foss also had a man in the Dalhart land office who'd been altering range records, and a man who drove for one of the freight operations who moved things that weren't freight. Corrigan was arrested quietly before dawn by one of Harker's deputies. There was no trouble. He came out of the bunkhouse in his union suit, blinking against the lantern, and when the deputy told him to get dressed and come along, he looked at Gus first, and then at me, and his face went through several things before it settled. He knew who'd put it together. He looked at me with those sycamore gray eyes, and what I saw in them was not rage exactly, but a kind of respect that I would have preferred not to have from him. Burke was suspended pending investigation. Harker didn't arrest him that week. The process took longer, but his badge went to a deputy named Crane who was younger and by all appearances honest. The cattle weren't coming back. Most of them had been sold and dispersed. Gus got a settlement eventually, much later, from the forfeited assets of Foss's operation, but that was months away and partial at best. Right now, standing in the yard on a cold Friday morning watching Corrigan ridden away toward Dalhart, Gus just looked like a man who'd found out a room in his house had been rotted through without his knowing. He turned to me. He started to say something, and then didn't. I said, "It's done now, Gus." He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed once and walked back into the house. I stood in the yard. The sky was pale and clean, the way it gets after a front pushes through, and the wind was down to almost nothing, which out here in December is almost unnatural. I could feel the cold in the ground through my boot soles. 60 head gone, and a betrayal I should have caught earlier, and a sheriff who'd been dirty, and a ring I'd had to piece together with a receipt and a ranger's widow, and 3 weeks of careful looking. I heard the door of the back room open, and Nora came out carrying 2 cups of coffee. She came across the yard and handed me one without any ceremony and stood beside me, looking at the road where Corrigan had gone. She was holding her cup in both hands, the way she did. I said, "You all right?" She said, "He'll face a jury." "He will." She sipped her coffee. "My husband's killers faced one too." I waited. She said 2 of them were convicted. One wasn't. The law is a crooked road, Mr. Briggs. But it's the road. I said I reckoned that was true. We stood there a while. The morning light was coming over the Caprock Rim, long and low and very clean. I could hear Gus's voice inside the house, calling for breakfast. I could hear the horses in the pen shifting, their feet crunching on the frozen ground. Nora said, "What do you do now?" I said, "Count what's left, start again." She looked at me then directly, and she said, "You're good at that." It was the same register as before, flat, observational, the kind of thing she said when she meant it exactly. "You're good at that. Starting again, counting what's left and going forward with it." I felt something move in my chest that I didn't quite have a name for. I said, "Nora." She looked at me. I said, "I'd like to keep talking to you. After this, I mean when the work is sorted, I'd like to just keep talking if that suits you." She was quiet long enough that I started to regret it. Not long, 10 seconds maybe, but long enough. Then she said, "It suits me." She went back inside. I stood in the yard with my coffee and the clean, cold air and the long morning light, and something felt different about the day. Not changed exactly, just more present, like the world had a bit more weight to it, a bit more ground under it. I went to work. The rest of December went quick. Ranch work fills time in a way that doesn't allow for self-indulgence, and we were short a hand with Corrigan gone, and the south fence line needed full inspection now that I knew it had been used as an exit route, and Gus was in a black mood that needed careful management. So I managed it. I managed the mood and the fence line and the work and the short-handedness and the accounting that needed to be done for the marshal's office, which turned out to be considerable. But we talked, Nora and I, not long conversations always and not every day. But they accumulated. She told me about her husband, a man named Frank Voss, who she'd married at 20 and buried at 28, and who had been, by her account, a very good man with a very dangerous vocation. She talked about him with the kind of steadiness that comes on the other side of grief, when you can speak of someone without the speaking undoing you. I respected that. She asked me about Clara. I told her. Less than I might have, I'm not a man who opens easily, but more than I'd told anyone in years. She listened the same way she always listened, fully, and when I was done she said, "She sounds like a woman who knew who she'd married." I didn't know exactly what she meant by that, but it felt like the right thing to say. We talked about the country, about whether the Lana would ever be tamed or whether taming it would just ruin it. We talked about cattle prices and what the spring might look like. We talked about books. She'd read more than I had, considerably more, and once she lent me a novel that I had no intention of reading and then read in 4 days. We talked about nothing sometimes, the shape of a cloud, the way a horse behaves before a storm. By Christmas, I had stopped pretending to myself that I wasn't in love with her. That's a strong word. I know what it means and I don't use it carelessly. But there it was, clear as a fence line on flat ground. I was in love with Nora Voss in the particular way of a man who'd stopped expecting that kind of thing and then found it anyway, which is maybe the most unsettling way it can happen because you're not ready for it and you can't pretend you don't see it. I didn't say anything to her for a while. That's probably not surprising. I'm not a man who says things before I know I mean them. New Year's came in cold and quiet. Gus and the Hands had a modest celebration, a bottle shared by the fire in the cookhouse, someone with a mouth organ. Nora sat with them for a while and then went back to the house. I sat by the fire longer than I needed to, and then I went and knocked on the door of the back room. She opened it. She had a lamp going and a book open on the table. She looked at me without surprise, like she'd been expecting the knock. I said, "I want to say something." She stepped back and let me in. The room was small and warm and smelled of beeswax and thread. She sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap and waited. I stood by the door. I said, "I know you came here for a season's work, and I know you have a life in San Antonio and a sister and whatever comes next for you. I'm not asking you to give any of that up or change it or decide anything tonight. I just want you to know, and I want to say it plain, because I don't do things by halves, that I think you're the most capable and honest person I've met in a very long time, and I have come to care for you considerably, and if you have any interest at all in the idea of." She stood up. She crossed the room and she took my face in both hands. Her hands were small and warm, and they had the roughness of work in them, the calluses of a woman who'd sewn 10,000 seams, and she looked at me, straight in, for a long moment. She said, "Cal." It was the first time she'd used my name, my first name. She said, "I've been waiting for you to finish thinking about it." And she kissed me, plain and direct the way she did everything. I put my arms around her and held her, and after a moment she put her head against my shoulder and let out a long breath, like something held for a long time was being let go. Outside the wind was gone. The night was still. Through the window of the back room I could see the stars over the lawn, oh, sharp and very close, the way they get in winter when there's no moisture in the air. I don't have a better word for it. I was home, not the building, not the land exactly, though I love the land. I was home in the way of a man who has been useful and steady and good at what he does and done it alone for so long that he'd mostly stopped noticing the alone part, and then had someone stand beside him, freely and clearly and with her eyes open, and choose him. That's all it was. It was everything. Marshal Harker came back through in February with the formal indictment papers on Foss and 4 of the men who'd worked the ring. He sat at Gus's table and went through it all again, the dates, the counts, the names, and I answered his questions, and Nora, who by then was sitting at that table as a matter of course, answered a few of her own regarding the receipts. Harker looked at her with the careful look of a man reassessing. He said, "Mrs. Voss, you were the one who found the receipts." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you held them for how long before bringing them to Briggs?" She said, 3 days. He looked at her. She said, "I needed to know who he was first." Harker looked at me and then back at her, and he had the ghost of something in his face that might have been a smile in a different man. He said, "Well, you got lucky there, ma'am." She said, "I'm not sure luck had much to do with it." Harker wrote something in his notebook and didn't say anything else. Voss's trial was in Amarillo in April. I went. Nora went with me. We were engaged by then, a quiet thing between us and Gus, no announcement yet, just settled, and we sat in the back of the courtroom and listened to 3 days of testimony. Calhoun had turned state's witness. 2 of Voss's writers had rolled on him in exchange for leniency. The records from the land office were in evidence. Voss himself sat straight through all of it, his face giving nothing. A compact, heavy-shouldered man. He looked at me once across the courtroom with the flat, measuring look of someone calculating where his plan had failed. I held his gaze. I know where it failed, I thought. It failed because a woman with a needle between her teeth and a careful eye noticed that the receipt under the sprung floorboard had a cracked fold that meant it had been there a while, and she picked it up instead of walking past it, and then she spent 3 weeks deciding who on this outfit she could trust. Voss was convicted on 4 counts. Sentenced to 12 years in the Huntsville unit. Calhoun got 5. We ate supper that night in Amarillo, a real restaurant with tablecloths, which felt strange after months of the cookhouse. Nora had a glass of wine and I had whiskey, and we didn't talk much about the trial. We talked about the spring work. We talked about whether the room off the kitchen was big enough or whether we ought to build on. She thought build on. I thought she was probably right. Walking back to the hotel, she took my arm. The streets of Amarillo in April have a particular smell, adobe dust and horse, and something sweet from the cottonwoods along the creek. And the evening was warm and the sky still had color in it, the last thin line of orange over the caprock. She said, "Are you all right?" I thought about it. I said, "I am." She leaned against my shoulder, just slightly walking. I said, "You know when Harker said we got lucky, that I was the right man to bring it to." She made a small sound that was not quite agreement. I said, "He was saying it about me, but I've been thinking I was the one who got lucky." She was quiet for a few steps. She said, "We can argue about that." I said, "We probably will." She laughed, which was a sound I had come to love unreasonably, and we walked on through the warm April dark. We were married in May, out at the Rafter P, with Gus and the Hands and a preacher who rode out from Dalhart, and a dinner that the cookhouse cook outdid himself on. Dorcas Pickett was back from Missouri by then, and she cried at the ceremony, which Gus endured with the expression of a man watching a river flood, helpless, resigned, not entirely displeased. Nora wore a dress she'd made herself, blue with small white buttons. She'd made it in the back room in the evenings of April, and I'd seen it folded on the work table once, but I hadn't looked at it closely, hadn't wanted to spoil it. Standing at the front of the yard with the preacher and the Hands arranged around us, and the morning light coming straight and clean off the lawn, I saw the dress properly for the first time. I saw her properly is what I mean. The way you see a person at a particular moment, complete. The preacher said the words, and we said ours, and Gus clapped me on the back so hard, I nearly stepped forward, and Delbert Ash whistled and Poco grinned from ear to ear, and didn't seem to care that he didn't entirely know what was happening. After, when it was quieter and the Hands had found the food and the preacher was talking to Gus, I stood with Nora at the edge of the yard where the fence line started. The grass was greening up. There were clouds building to the northwest, the big white spring kind, not weather yet, just the sky showing what it could do. She had her hand in the crook of my arm. She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking about the cattle tally. We need to start the count this week if we're going to." She pressed my arm. I said, "I'm thinking that I didn't expect any of this." She said, "Neither did I." I said, "I'm glad it went the way it did." She turned to look at me with those steady eyes. She said, "So am I, Cal, so am I." The clouds were moving slow over the caprock. The grass was moving with the wind. Somewhere in the near pasture, one of the horses made a sound, that low, flat sound they make for no particular reason, just to say they're there. I had my wife beside me. I had my ranch. I had my work, which I was good at, which I'd always been good at. 60 head gone, but a winter's rustling broken, and a dirty ring brought down, and the county better for it. There are men who go their whole lives waiting to be seen clearly, not celebrated, not praised. Just seen by someone with clear eyes, someone who looked at what you were and decided it was worth staying for. I was that man. I'd been that man a long time. Standing in the May morning with Nora's hand in the crook of my arm, I thought, well, you got there. The clouds turned, the light shifted, we went in to eat.